He was quiet, careful, everything I wasn't supposed to want. But sometimes the heart forgets the rules. One glance, one moment, and everything changed. We never said the words out loud, but I felt them every time he looked at me. It wasn't love I could keep, it was love that refused to die. And even now, years later, I still hear his voice when the world gets quiet. When my mother remarried, I was 21 and too old to pretend it didn't change anything. She'd met David Collier during one of those charity events she used to organize, the kind of place where people sip wine and talk about saving the world while hiding their own brokenness. He was older, quiet, with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. The first time I saw him, I remember thinking he didn't look like someone who could belong to us. He was too composed, too deliberate. My mother was all laughter and light, but David seemed like a storm that refused to pass. He moved into our home that fall, the same week the leaves began to die outside. I was in my final year of college, home only on weekends, but something about that house began to feel smaller whenever he was in it. He didn't try too hard to be friendly, didn't ask too many questions, but when he spoke, people listened. And I hated that I noticed the way he filled the room, how his voice made the air hum differently. The first few months were awkward. Mom would look between us at dinner, smiling too much, as if she could glue a family together with polite conversation. I would nod, pretending everything was fine, but my thoughts kept wandering, not where they should. I told myself it was curiosity, fascination, something harmless. But I knew better. David never treated me like a child. He saw through my temper, my sarcasm, my attempts to seem untouchable. One night, after an argument with Mom about my future, I slammed the door and ran out onto the porch. It was raining hard, cold enough to sting. He found me sitting on the steps, knees pulled to my chest. He didn't lecture. He just stood there, holding an umbrella over both of us, saying quietly, "You don't have to fight so hard to be seen." It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, like he understood a part of me no one had ever tried to reach. Something inside me cracked. After that night, I started noticing things I shouldn't. How he read in the mornings by the window, how his hands looked when he fixed things around the house, how calm he was when my mother's temper rose. I began to crave his steadiness the way I used to crave approval. It was wrong, I knew it, but hearts don't follow laws. They break them without permission. There was one summer evening that changed everything. My mother was away visiting my aunt, and I came home early from work. The house was quiet except for the sound of music coming from the living room. David was there, sitting on the floor surrounded by old records, a glass of bourbon beside him. I teased him about his taste in music, and he laughed, the first real laugh I'd ever heard from him. I sat down, too close, and we listened to an old Fleetwood Mac song that felt too perfect for the moment. When I looked at him, he was already looking at me. It wasn't a touch or a confession, just a silence that said everything. The kind of silence that burns louder than words. I remember my pulse in my ears, my breath catching, his eyes soft but heavy with something forbidden. Then he looked away. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice low. "You've had a long day." That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, replaying that moment until dawn. I told myself it was nothing, but it lingered in every glance afterward, at breakfast, at the sound of his footsteps, at the brush of his hand when he passed me the car keys. We were careful, but the air between us was no longer innocent. My mother never noticed, or maybe she didn't want to. Months passed like that, small moments that meant everything but led nowhere. Once he left a note on the kitchen counter after I'd helped him organize his office. "Thank you. You make this house feel alive." I stared at that line for hours. It wasn't love, I tried to convince myself. Just loneliness finding company in the wrong place. But deep down, I knew it was something real, something that had no name we were allowed to use. Then everything broke the day Mom fell ill. It wasn't sudden. She'd been hiding symptoms for months. Cancer. The word swallowed the house whole. David turned into her shadow, sleeping by her side. doing everything right, everything a husband should do. I hated myself for the flicker of jealousy that came with seeing them together, but I also admired him for never wavering. He took care of her with a devotion that made my heart ache even more. The night before she died, she asked me to promise one thing. Don't run from the things that scare you, Harper. I nodded, but I didn't understand then what she meant. Not until after the funeral, when the house became unbearably silent. For weeks, David and I barely spoke. He spent his days fixing things that didn't need fixing, and I drifted from room to room like a ghost. Then one evening, I found him in the backyard, sitting on the porch with his head in his hands. He looked smaller somehow, broken in a way I'd never seen. I sat beside him, and for a long time we just watched the sunset. No words, no pretending. Then he whispered, I don't know how to be here without her. I wanted to tell him I didn't either. I wanted to tell him he wasn't the only one who'd lost something he couldn't name. But I only said, you don't have to be alone. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a second, the world narrowed to just the two of us. Every unspoken feeling between us surfaced all at once. His eyes glistened. Mine did too. He reached out, touched my hand, gently, hesitantly, and I didn't pull away. We sat like that until the stars came out, hands barely touching, knowing we were standing on the edge of something we could never step into. Finally, he said, some love isn't meant to be lived, Harper. It's just meant to be understood. That night, I cried harder than I ever had. Not because I'd lost him, but because I knew he was right. Loving him wasn't something I could erase, but it wasn't something I could keep either. Some feelings live quietly, like ghosts that refuse to leave, and maybe that's their purpose, to teach us how deep the heart can go without breaking completely. A few months later, David sold the house and moved to the coast. I finished college and started a new job in a different city. We wrote a few letters in the beginning, short, careful, distant. Then even those stopped. Time did what it always does. It softened the edges of what once felt impossible. Years later, I found one of his old records in a box I'd forgotten to unpack. Fleetwood Mac. I played it, and suddenly I was back in that room again, young, lost, wanting something the world would never understand. I smiled through the ache, because now I did understand. What we had wasn't a mistake. It was a moment of truth that refused to fit into the rules life gave us. Sometimes when I walk by the ocean, I think of him. I imagine he's somewhere on another shore, hearing the same waves, remembering me in the same quiet way, not with regret, but with gratitude for the love that taught us restraint and the goodbye that made us whole. Because not every story is meant to end with forever. Some end with forgiveness, and that, I think, is its own kind of love.